At 1 in the morning, my daughter Sarah arrived at my door. Her face was swollen, mascara running down her cheeks like black rivers of pain. She could barely speak through her sobs. "He hit me, Mom, because of his mistress. He said I was getting in the way of his happiness." I pulled her inside, my heart breaking into 1,000 pieces as I saw the purple bruise around her left eye. 23 years of marriage, 2 beautiful children. And this is how it ends? With my baby girl beaten by the man I once thought was worthy of her love? Can you imagine receiving your own daughter in this state? Can you picture the rage that burns in a mother's chest when she sees her child destroyed by someone who promised to protect her? What would you do if the person you trusted most in the world came to your door, broken and asking for help? As I helped Sarah to the guest room and applied ice to her wounds, something inside me shifted. I remained calm on the surface, comforting her with gentle words, but my mind was already working. You see, most people don't know who Elizabeth Astor really is. They see a 62-year-old retired woman, someone who bakes cookies for her grandchildren and tends her garden on weekends. But what they don't know is that I spent 35 years as a federal agent, specialized in domestic cases and witness protection. And in all those years, I learned something crucial. There are 2 types of justice in this world, the one that happens in courtrooms and the one that happens in the shadows. After putting Sarah to bed, I went to my study and opened a drawer that hadn't been touched in 5 years. Inside was my old badge, some documents, and a secure phone that only 3 people in the world knew existed. I put on my uniform, not the floral dress Elizabeth Astor wears to church, but the black outfit that Agent Astor used in her most dangerous operations. I picked up that phone, dialed a number I knew by heart, and when a familiar voice answered, I said only, "It's time. Execute the plan." Because you see, 6 months ago, I had already discovered what my son-in-law was planning. And since then, I've been preparing something that will not only protect my daughter, but ensure that Michael Thompson learns what happens when you mess with the wrong family. What I'm about to tell you is the story of how a mother's love became an unstoppable force, and how 35 years of experience in law enforcement became the perfect weapon for a very personal war. My name is Elizabeth Astor. I'm 62 years old, and I spent most of my life hunting down men exactly like my son-in-law. The difference is, this time, it's personal. And when it's personal, Elizabeth Astor doesn't just seek justice, she becomes justice. What happened next would forever change not just Michael's life, but the lives of everyone who thought they could underestimate a mother's fury. And it all started with one phone call at 1:30 in the morning. The next morning, I woke up before dawn, as I had done for the past 35 years of my career. Old habits die hard, especially when you've spent decades tracking criminals who thought they were smarter than the system. I made coffee in silence, watching Sarah sleep through the living room window. Her face was still swollen, but she looked peaceful for the first time in months. What she didn't know was that her nightmare was about to become Michael's worst fear. At 7 sharp, my phone rang. It was Michael, and his voice carried that practiced concern that I had learned to recognize in countless interrogation rooms. "Elizabeth, is Sarah there? She didn't come home last night, and I'm worried sick. We had a small argument, but nothing serious. You know how emotional she gets sometimes." The audacity of this man never ceased to amaze me. He was calling the mother of the woman he had beaten, pretending to be the concerned husband, using the same manipulative tone I had heard from abusers for decades. "She's here, Michael," I replied, keeping my voice steady. She needed some time to think. What I didn't tell him was that while he was calling me, my old partner, Detective Rodriguez, was already positioned outside his office building, documenting every move he made. What Michael also didn't know was that 3 months ago, I had installed surveillance equipment in his house, legally, of course, with Sarah's permission when she started suspecting the affair. After hanging up, I went to my study and reviewed the evidence I had been gathering. Photos of Michael entering hotels with his secretary Amanda Clark, bank statements showing mysterious transfers to an offshore account, credit card receipts from jewelry stores, jewelry that never made it to my daughter. But the most damning evidence was the recording from last week, when Michael was on the phone with his lawyer discussing how to get rid of Sarah and keep all the assets from their marriage. The phrase that haunts me most was, "The old lady won't be a problem. Elizabeth is just a retired housewife who spends her time gardening. She has no idea what's coming." If only he knew that this old lady had spent 3 decades dismantling criminal networks much more sophisticated than his pathetic little scheme. At 10 in the morning, I received the call I had been waiting for. It was Agent Martinez from the Financial Crimes Division. Yes, the same division where I used to work. "Elizabeth, we have everything we need. The offshore accounts, the money laundering through his construction company, the tax evasion. But there's something else you need to know." My blood ran cold. Amanda Clark isn't just his mistress. She's been married to Vincent Romano for 8 years. Vincent Romano. The name hit me like a punch to the stomach. I knew that name from my active years. A mid-level criminal who specialized in insurance fraud and had connections with some very dangerous people. This wasn't just about an affair anymore. This was about my daughter being married to a man who was involved with organized crime. Sarah wasn't just being abused. She was in mortal danger, and she didn't even know it. Michael wasn't just planning to divorce her and steal her money. He was planning to make her disappear completely. I hung up the phone and felt something I hadn't felt in years. The cold, calculated fury that had made me one of the most effective agents in my division. Michael Thompson had made the biggest mistake of his life. He had underestimated a mother's love and a federal agent's resources. But more than that, he had threatened my family while thinking he was dealing with a harmless old woman. I walked to Sarah's room and watched her sleeping. My beautiful daughter, who had given the best years of her life to a monster. She deserved better than this. She deserved justice. And justice was exactly what she was going to get. Because Michael was about to learn that Elizabeth Astor never retired from protecting her family. I had simply been waiting for the right case. And this case, my daughter's life, was going to be my masterpiece. What Michael would discover in the next few days was that when you threaten a mother's child, you don't just face a woman seeking revenge. You face 35 years of experience, a network of federal contacts, and a fury that has no limits. The hunt was about to begin, and the prey had no idea he was already in the trap. Sarah woke up around noon, and I could see in her eyes the shame that every abuse victim carries, that misplaced guilt that somehow makes them believe they deserved what happened. I sat beside her with a cup of tea and said something that surprised her. "Honey, I need to tell you something about your mother that you don't know. And then you're going to help me destroy the man who hurt you." For the first time since she arrived, Sarah looked directly at me. "Mom, what are you talking about?" I walked to my closet and pulled out a box I hadn't opened in 5 years. Inside were commendations, photos from operations, and my service weapon, a Glock 19 that had been my companion in the most dangerous moments of my career. "Sarah, your mother wasn't always a housewife who bakes cookies. For 35 years, I was Special Agent Elizabeth Astor, specialized in domestic violence cases and organized crime." I watched my daughter's face transform as I showed her photos of me in operations, letters of recognition from the FBI director, newspaper clippings about cases I had solved. "The Michael Thompson you married isn't just an abusive husband, sweetheart. He's a criminal connected to very dangerous people. And what happened to you last night wasn't just domestic violence, it was attempted murder." Sarah's hands trembled as she held a photo of me receiving a medal for dismantling a criminal network in Chicago. "Mom, I don't understand. Why didn't you ever tell me?" The answer was simple and painful. "Because I wanted you to have a normal mother, not someone whose job was hunting monsters. But now, one of those monsters married my daughter. And Agent Astor doesn't stay retired when her family is threatened." At 2 in the afternoon, Detective Rodriguez called with news that made my blood boil. "Elizabeth, we followed Michael to his office this morning. He made 3 calls, one to his lawyer, one to Vincent Romano, and one to a man named Carlos Mendez." Carlos Mendez. I knew that name too. He was Romano's enforcer, the man who made inconvenient people disappear. Michael wasn't just planning to divorce Sarah. He was planning to have her killed and make it look like an accident. I explained the situation to Sarah and watched her face go from disbelief to terror to something I recognized immediately, the determination of a woman who has decided to fight back. "Mom, what do we do?" She asked the question, but her eyes already knew the answer. We weren't going to run. We weren't going to hide. We were going to do what I had done for 35 years. We were going to hunt the hunter. First, you're going to stay here in this house, which is more secure than Fort Knox. Second, you're going to give me permission to access all your accounts, your emails, your phone records, everything Michael has been using to control you. Third, you're going to trust your mother to do what she does best, turn predators into prey. That afternoon, I made a call that I never thought I would make again. Agent Patricia Collins, my former partner, now director of the Organized Crime Division. Patricia, it's Elizabeth. I need a favor, a big one.
Her voice carried the warmth of 20 years of friendship and the respect of someone who had seen me work. Elizabeth, you know you don't need to ask. What's the situation? When I finished explaining, Patricia was silent for a long moment. Then she said something that filled me with a cold satisfaction. Elizabeth, Michael Thompson just became a person of interest in 3 different federal investigations.
Vincent Romano has been on our radar for months, and if Thompson is connected to him, we have probable cause for everything. How much time do you need? 72 hours, I replied without hesitation. In 72 hours, Michael Thompson will either be in federal custody or he'll wish he was. What I didn't tell Patricia was that Michael had already made his biggest mistake. He had given me a reason to come out of retirement. And when Elizabeth Astor comes out of retirement, she doesn't just solve cases, she ends them permanently. That night, as Sarah slept peacefully for the first time in months, I sat in my study reviewing files, making calls, and planning something that would have been impossible for a regular citizen, but was routine for someone with my background. The complete destruction of Michael Thompson's life, not through revenge, but through justice, not through violence, but through the law, not through hatred, but through the systematic application of 35 years of experience in making criminals pay for their crimes. Michael Thompson thought he was married to a naive young woman whose mother was a harmless retiree. What he was about to discover was that he had declared war on a federal agent who specialized in cases exactly like his. And in that war, there would be only one possible outcome: his complete and total defeat. The hunt had officially begun. Thursday morning brought news that confirmed my worst fears and my greatest hopes at the same time. Agent Martinez called at exactly 7 in the morning with information that made my coffee turn cold in my hands. Elizabeth, we cracked Michael's communications. You need to hear this recording from Tuesday night, just hours before he attacked Sarah. The voice that came through the phone was Michael's, but it was a Michael that Sarah had never heard. Cold, calculating, and utterly without conscience. Romano, we have a problem. Sarah is starting to ask too many questions about the money. She found some of the bank statements. Then came Romano's voice, gravelly and threatening. Michael, you knew this day would come. Either you handle your wife, or we handle her permanently. Carlos is ready whenever you give the word. My hands clenched into fists as I heard Michael's response. Give me until Friday. If I can't convince her to back off, then we'll make it look like an accident. Car crash, maybe, or a break-in gone wrong. The casual way he discussed murdering my daughter, his own wife, sent a rage through me that I hadn't felt since my darkest cases. But this rage wasn't destructive. It was surgical, precise, and absolutely focused. After hanging up, I called Sarah into my study. She needed to understand the full scope of what we were facing. Sweetheart, the man who hit you Tuesday night wasn't acting out of anger or jealousy. He was following orders from criminals who want you dead. I played her portions of the recording, watching her face transform from disbelief to horror to something that reminded me of myself at her age. Pure determination. Mom, they're planning to kill me? She whispered, but her voice was steady. Yes, honey. But here's what they don't know. They're planning to kill the daughter of someone who has spent 3 decades preventing exactly these kinds of murders. And they just activated the most extensive network of federal agents, local police, and private investigators that this city has ever seen. At 10 in the morning, my living room transformed into something resembling a war room. Detective Rodriguez arrived first, bringing files on Vincent Romano that made my stomach turn. This man wasn't just involved in financial crimes. He had been connected to 7 suspicious deaths over the past 5 years, all of them people who had become inconvenient to his operations. Then came Agent Collins, accompanied by Agent Torres from the Financial Crimes Division. What they brought was better than Christmas morning: a complete financial profile of Michael's activities over the past 2 years. Elizabeth, your son-in-law has been laundering money for Romano through his construction company. We're talking about $2.7 million in illegal transactions. But the piece of information that changed everything came from Detective Sandra Walsh, a specialist in domestic violence cases who had worked with me on dozens of operations. Elizabeth, Michael isn't Romano's only inside man. There are 4 other men in the city doing exactly what Michael does, marrying women with assets, laundering money through their businesses, and then eliminating them when they become liabilities. This wasn't just about Sarah anymore. This was about a criminal network that was systematically murdering women across the city. And Michael Thompson, the man who had fooled my family for 5 years, was part of an organized killing machine that specialized in destroying families like ours. If you're watching this and thinking that this kind of evil doesn't exist in your neighborhood, let me tell you something. It exists everywhere. These predators are experts at blending in, at appearing to be perfect husbands and model citizens. They count on our trust, our love, and our inability to believe that someone so close to us could be planning our destruction. As I looked at the evidence spread across my dining table, I felt something that I hadn't experienced in years: the absolute certainty that justice was not only possible, but inevitable. Michael Thompson had made the mistake of choosing the wrong victim. He had selected the daughter of someone who possessed not only the skills to destroy him, but the network to ensure that his destruction would be complete and permanent. Ladies and gentlemen, I said to my team, we're not just saving my daughter's life. We're dismantling an entire criminal network that has been murdering women with impunity for years. And we're going to do it in a way that ensures none of them ever hurt another family again. Agent Collins smiled, the same smile I had seen on her face 20 years ago when we closed the most important case of our careers. Elizabeth, it's good to have you back. What's the plan? The plan was something that would have been impossible for a civilian, difficult for a single agent, but routine for a team like ours: the complete infiltration and destruction of Vincent Romano's operation, starting with the man who had dared to threaten my family. Michael Thompson thought he was about to become a widower. What he was actually about to become was the key witness in the biggest organized crime bust this city had seen in decades. Friday morning arrived with a phone call that made everything crystal clear. It was Michael, and his voice carried the false warmth of a predator preparing to strike. Elizabeth, I'd like to come by this afternoon to talk to Sarah. We need to work things out, and I think it's time she came home. The audacity was breathtaking. 24 hours after beating my daughter, he was ready to collect his victim and proceed with his plan. Of course, Michael, I replied, keeping my voice perfectly calm. Come by around 4 o'clock. I'll make sure Sarah is ready to talk. What I didn't tell him was that by 4 o'clock, my house would be equipped with enough surveillance equipment to record a confession that would put him away for life, and that Sarah wouldn't just be ready to talk. She would be ready to perform the most important role of her life. After hanging up, I turned to my daughter, who had been listening from the kitchen doorway. The transformation in her face over the past 3 days had been remarkable. The broken woman who had arrived at my door was gone, replaced by someone who reminded me of the determined young girl who had once announced she was going to be a lawyer, like her mother wanted to be. Mom, I know what you're going to ask me to do, and yes, I'm ready. At noon, Agent Collins arrived with equipment that would turn my living room into the most sophisticated recording studio the FBI had ever deployed in a domestic setting. Hidden cameras, directional microphones, and backup recording devices that would capture every word, every gesture, every incriminating moment of Michael's visit. But the most important element wasn't technological. It was psychological. Detective Walsh had spent 2 hours with Sarah, teaching her techniques that domestic violence counselors use to get abusers to reveal their true nature. Sarah, men like Michael are fundamentally arrogant. They can't resist explaining their superiority, especially to women they consider inferior. All you have to do is ask the right questions and let his ego do the rest. At 3:30, I received a call that completed the puzzle in a way that made my blood run cold. It was Agent Martinez, and his voice was urgent. Elizabeth, we've been monitoring Romano's communications all week. 15 minutes ago, he called Carlos Mendez and told him to be ready for the cleanup tonight. Michael isn't coming to reconcile with Sarah. He's coming to take her somewhere she'll never be found. The genius of their plan was terrifying in its simplicity. Michael would convince Sarah to come home, promising counseling and a fresh start. Then, sometime after midnight, there would be a break-in at their house. Sarah would be killed during the robbery, and Michael would be the grieving widower who inherited everything. It was a plan they had executed successfully 4 times before with other wives of other men in Romano's network. What they didn't know was that their plan was about to become the evidence that would destroy them all. At 3:45, I sat with Sarah in my kitchen and held her hands. Hands that were steady despite everything she had learned about the man she had loved for 5 years. "Sweetheart, I need you to understand something. What happens in the next hour will determine whether you live or die. But more than that, it will determine whether 4 other families finally get justice for their murdered daughters." I showed her photographs of the other victims. Maria Santos, 28, found dead after a supposed break-in 3 months after she discovered her husband's financial irregularities. Jennifer Walsh, 32, killed in a car accident 2 weeks after she hired a divorce attorney. Linda Morrison, 29, died of an apparent overdose just days after she confronted her husband about his affair. Rebecca Chen, 31, found dead in her home after what police ruled a domestic dispute gone wrong. These women died because they discovered what you discovered. They died because they threatened what you threatened. They died because no one was there to protect them the way I'm here to protect you. Sarah looked at each photograph with the intensity of someone memorizing faces for a final exam. "Mom, I understand. This isn't just about me anymore." At 4 o'clock sharp, Michael's BMW pulled into my driveway. Through the window, I watched him check his appearance in the rearview mirror, practicing the concerned expression he would use to manipulate my daughter one last time. He had no idea that every step he took toward my front door was being recorded by 6 different cameras, or that his arrival had been reported to a federal task force that was now positioning itself around my neighborhood. As the doorbell rang, I felt the familiar calm that had always preceded my most dangerous operations. This was the moment when everything I had learned in 35 years of federal service would be put to the ultimate test. Not to save strangers, not to serve justice in the abstract, but to protect my own daughter from a monster who had lived in our family for 5 years. Michael Thompson was about to walk into the most sophisticated trap ever set by someone who had spent 3 decades perfecting the art of catching criminals who thought they were untouchable. And in the next 60 minutes, he was going to confess to enough crimes to ensure that he would never threaten another family again. The final act was about to begin. Michael walked through my front door with the confidence of a man who believed he held all the cards. His smile was perfect, concerned but optimistic, hurt but forgiving. It was the same smile that had charmed my family for 5 years, the same expression that had fooled us all into believing he was the loving husband my daughter deserved. If I hadn't spent 3 decades studying predators exactly like him, I might have been fooled again. "Elizabeth, thank you for letting me come. I know this has been difficult for everyone." He embraced me with what appeared to be genuine affection, and I felt a chill as I realized how naturally the performance came to him. This wasn't a man pretending to be good. This was a man who had become expert at wearing goodness like a mask while planning the most evil acts imaginable. Sarah entered the living room, and I watched Michael's face carefully. For just a fraction of a second, I saw something that confirmed everything we suspected. Cold calculation behind the loving concern. He was studying her injuries, not with remorse, but with the clinical assessment of someone evaluating how much time he had before the evidence faded. "Sarah, sweetheart, I am so sorry about what happened. I don't know what came over me. The stress at work, the financial problems we've been having. None of that is an excuse for what I did to you." The apology was textbook perfect, hitting every note that domestic violence counselors teach victims to recognize as manipulation. But Sarah was no longer the naive woman who had believed his lies for years. "Michael, I need to understand something," Sarah said, her voice carefully controlled. "The financial problems you mentioned, are they related to the money that's been disappearing from our accounts?" I felt a surge of pride as I watched my daughter deploy the techniques Detective Walsh had taught her. She was asking exactly the right question to trigger his arrogance. Michael's smile flickered for just a moment. "Sarah, you don't need to worry about our finances. That's my responsibility as your husband. Some investments haven't performed as well as expected, but everything will be fine once we get through this rough patch." The condescension in his voice was unmistakable. He was talking to her the way someone talks to a child who has asked an inconvenient question. "But Michael, I saw the statements. $2.7 million has passed through our construction company account in the past year, but our tax returns show a completely different income. Where did that money come from?" Sarah's question hit its mark perfectly. I watched Michael's face transform as his ego warred with his caution. The need to demonstrate his superiority was battling with his survival instinct. "Sarah, you're getting upset over nothing. Business finances are complicated, and women don't usually understand these kinds of transactions." There it was, the arrogance that would destroy him. Detective Walsh had been right. Men like Michael can't resist explaining why they're smarter than everyone else, especially the women they consider their property. "I'm not just any woman, Michael. I have a master's degree in accounting. I understand financial transactions perfectly well. What I don't understand is why my husband is laundering money for Vincent Romano." The name hit him like a physical blow. His face went white, then flushed red, and I saw his hands clench into fists, the same fists that had struck my daughter 3 days ago. "How do you know that name?" His voice was no longer the loving husband. This was the voice of a criminal who had been cornered, and I felt every muscle in my body tense as I recognized the shift. This was the moment when Michael Thompson stopped pretending and showed us who he really was. Sarah looked him straight in the eyes with a courage that filled me with maternal pride. "I know that name because I know exactly what kind of man I married. I know about Amanda Clark. I know about Carlos Mendez. I know about the plan to make me disappear tonight. The question is, are you going to tell me the truth? Or are you going to keep lying until the federal agents outside decide they've heard enough?" The silence that followed was deafening. Michael's eyes darted around the room, and I could see him processing what Sarah had just said. Federal agents, outside. His mind was racing, trying to calculate whether this was a bluff or whether his carefully constructed world was collapsing around him. "You're bluffing," he said finally, but his voice lacked conviction. "Your mother is a retired housewife, and you're an emotional woman who watches too many crime shows. There are no federal agents outside." I stood up slowly, and when I spoke, my voice carried the authority of 3 decades in federal service. "Michael, allow me to properly introduce myself. I'm Special Agent Elizabeth Astor, retired Federal Bureau of Investigation. I've spent 35 years investigating men exactly like you. And you're right about one thing. There aren't just federal agents outside. There are federal agents, local police, and a SWAT team that's been listening to every word you've said for the past 20 minutes. I watched the color drain from his face as the full magnitude of his situation became clear. He wasn't just facing exposure, he was facing federal charges for money laundering, conspiracy to commit murder, and domestic violence. He was facing the end of everything he had built through years of manipulation and crime. But Michael Thompson had one more card to play, and as I saw his hand move toward his jacket, I realized that our trap had worked too well. He was about to do something desperate, and desperate men are the most dangerous of all. Michael's hand froze halfway to his jacket as he heard the unmistakable sound of my Glock being cocked. 35 years of federal training had taught me to recognize the exact moment when a cornered criminal decides to fight rather than flee. And Michael had just reached that point. "I wouldn't do that if I were you, Michael. Whatever you have in that jacket stays exactly where it is." His eyes widened as he realized that the harmless housewife he had dismissed was holding a service weapon with the steady grip of someone who had used it professionally for decades. "You see, Michael, this is what happens when you underestimate your opponent. You spend so much time planning the perfect crime that you forget to research the people you're planning to destroy." Sarah moved smoothly to the opposite side of the room, another technique Detective Walsh had taught her. "In a confrontation with an armed suspect, you never give them a single target to focus on. Michael," she said, her voice remarkably calm, "the gun my mother is holding has been used to stop men much more dangerous than you. I suggest you sit down and start telling us the truth." The transformation in Michael's face was complete. Gone was any pretense of the loving husband or concerned family man. What remained was pure criminal calculation, the cold intelligence that had allowed him to murder 4 other women without getting caught. You think you're so smart, Elizabeth, but you have no idea what you're dealing with. Romano's organization doesn't just disappear inconvenient people. We destroy entire families. Your daughter, your grandchildren, everyone you've ever cared about. Actually, Michael, I know exactly what Romano's organization does. I've been studying it for 6 months, ever since I realized that my daughter had married a criminal. I reached into my pocket with my free hand and pulled out a photograph that made his face go ashen. It was a surveillance photo of him meeting with Carlos Mendez outside a warehouse 3 weeks ago. You see, while you were planning Sarah's murder, I was documenting every aspect of your criminal activities. Bank records, phone calls, meetings, financial transactions. Everything you thought was secret has been recorded, photographed, and filed with the federal prosecutor's office. The photograph fluttered to the floor between us, and Michael stared at it as if it were his own death warrant. But here's what I find most interesting, Michael. In all my years investigating organized crime, I've never encountered a network quite like Romano's. Most criminal organizations avoid domestic violence cases because they're too messy, too emotional, too likely to attract law enforcement attention. But Romano found a way to turn domestic violence into a profit center. Sarah picked up the thread perfectly, her voice carrying the authority of someone who now understood the full scope of what they were facing. You marry women with assets. You use their businesses to launder Romano's money. When they get suspicious or threaten to leave, you have them killed and inherit everything. It's brilliant in its simplicity and absolutely monstrous in its execution. Michael's silence was answer enough, but I needed him to confess on tape. The problem with your operation, Michael, is that it depends on choosing the right victims. Women who are isolated, financially naive, emotionally vulnerable. Women whose families won't ask too many questions when they die suddenly. I stepped closer, keeping the gun trained on his chest. What you didn't know is that Sarah Astor is the daughter of a federal agent who has spent her entire career protecting women exactly like the ones you've been murdering. Maria Santos was 28 years old when you had her killed. She had discovered that her husband was using her catering business to launder money. Jennifer Walsh was 32. She found out about the offshore accounts and hired a divorce attorney. Linda Morrison, Rebecca Chen, all of them discovered what Sarah discovered. All of them threatened what Sarah threatened, and all of them died because they didn't have someone like me protecting them. For the first time since he had entered my house, Michael spoke without calculating his words. You don't understand. These women were liabilities. They were going to destroy everything we had built. Romano's operation employs 50 people, moves $20 million a year through legitimate businesses. We couldn't let a few emotional wives bring down something that important. There it was, the confession that would put him away for life. Not just an admission of guilt, but a complete explanation of motive, method, and organization. Agent Collins was right when she said that criminals always want to explain how smart they are, even when that explanation destroys them. So you admit that you've been part of a criminal conspiracy that has resulted in the murder of at least 4 women? Sarah asked, her voice steady despite the magnitude of what she was hearing. Yes, Michael replied, his arrogance finally overriding his survival instinct. And Sarah would have been the 5th if you hadn't interfered. The silence that followed was broken by a sound that filled me with profound satisfaction. The front door opening and Agent Collins announcing, "Federal agents. Michael Thompson, you are under arrest for conspiracy to commit murder, money laundering, and racketeering." As the handcuffs clicked around Michael's wrists, he looked at me with pure hatred. "This isn't over, Elizabeth. Romano has resources you can't imagine. Your family will never be safe." I smiled at him with the cold satisfaction of someone who had just completed the most important case of her career. "Actually, Michael, it is over. Because while you were confessing to multiple murders in my living room, federal agents were simultaneously arresting Vincent Romano, Carlos Mendez, and 12 other members of your organization. Your entire network just collapsed, and you're the one who brought it down by underestimating a mother's love." As they led him away, Michael looked back one last time, and I saw something in his eyes that I had seen in countless criminals over the years.
The moment when they realized that their victim was actually their predator, and their perfect crime was actually their perfect downfall. The next 72 hours were a whirlwind of activity that reminded me why I had loved federal work so much. My house became the unofficial headquarters for the largest organized crime bust in the city's history, and I found myself back in my element in a way I hadn't experienced since retirement. Agent Collins had set up a command center in my dining room, and the constant flow of information coming in was better than any crime novel ever written. Saturday morning brought news that exceeded even my most optimistic expectations. Agent Martinez called at 6 a.m. with an update that made my coffee taste like victory. Elizabeth, the Romano operation was even bigger than we thought. When we raided his offices yesterday, we found records of 17 different businesses being used for money laundering. But more importantly, we found evidence linking them to 12 suspicious deaths over the past 3 years, not just the 4 we knew about. 12 women. 12 wives who had trusted the wrong men, who had discovered inconvenient truths, who had died because they threatened a criminal empire built on their graves. As I listened to their names being read over the phone, I felt a rage so pure it was almost spiritual. These weren't just statistics. They were daughters, mothers, sisters who had been erased by men who saw them as nothing more than obstacles to profit. Sarah was in the kitchen when I hung up, and she could see the determination in my face. "Mom, how many more are there?" The question hung in the air like smoke from a gun that had just been fired. "Too many, sweetheart. But here's what Michael and Romano didn't understand. When you kill 12 women, you create 12 families who want justice. And when those families have a federal agent working for them, justice becomes inevitable." By Sunday, the scope of our success was becoming clear in ways that filled me with professional pride. Detective Rodriguez called with news that the financial investigation had uncovered a money laundering operation that spanned 4 states and involved over $60 million in illegal transactions. "Elizabeth, your son-in-law wasn't just a foot soldier in this organization. He was one of Romano's top lieutenants. The man you had living in your family for 5 years was responsible for coordinating the murders of at least 7 women. 7 women. I had been eating Sunday dinner with a man who had orchestrated the deaths of 7 innocent people. I had welcomed him into my home, trusted him with my daughter's life, and he had been planning to make her victim number 8. The thought sent a chill through me that had nothing to do with the weather and everything to do with how close we had come to losing everything. But the most satisfying call came Sunday evening from Agent Torres in financial crimes. "Elizabeth, we've been tracking the money trail, and it led us to something we never expected. Romano's operation wasn't just laundering money. They were stealing it from the businesses of the women they killed. Maria Santos had accumulated $200,000 in her catering business. Jennifer Walsh had $400,000 in savings. Linda Morrison had a life insurance policy worth $700,000. The pattern was crystal clear now. These men didn't just marry women and kill them. They selected victims based on their financial assets. They were running a systematic murder-for-profit operation disguised as domestic violence. It was evil in its purest form, and it had been operating successfully for years because no one had connected the dots between seemingly unrelated domestic tragedies. Monday brought the news I had been waiting for since this whole nightmare began. Agent Collins called with an update that made me feel like celebrating for the first time in weeks. "Elizabeth, Carlos Mendez broke this morning. He's confessed to 7 murders and provided details about 12 others. Vincent Romano is facing federal charges that will put him away for life without parole. But here's the best part. Mendez identified 6 other criminal networks in different cities that are running identical operations. 6 other networks in different cities. This wasn't just about saving Sarah's life anymore. This was about dismantling a nationwide criminal conspiracy that had been murdering women with impunity for years. And it had all started with one phone call at 1:30 in the morning when my daughter arrived at my door with a bruised face and a broken heart. Tuesday afternoon, I received a call that put everything in perspective. It was Detective Walsh, and her voice carried the satisfaction of someone who had just closed the most important case of her career. "Elizabeth, I wanted you to know that we've been contacted by families in 7 different states. They've seen the news coverage about Romano's arrest, and they think their daughters might have been victims of similar operations.
your decision to come out of retirement and protect Sarah has opened the door to justice for women whose families never thought they would get answers. As I hung up the phone, Sarah came into my study and sat in the chair where she had learned that her husband was planning to kill her. "Mom, I need to ask you something. If you had known what Michael was when I first brought him home, would you have warned me?" The question was more complex than it appeared, touching on every parent's dilemma about how much to interfere in their children's lives. "Sweetheart, if I had known what Michael was, he never would have made it to a second date with you." But that's not the real question. The real question is, what do we do now that we know how many other women are in the same danger you were in? Sarah looked at me with an expression I recognized from my own mirror during my most determined moments. "We make sure this never happens to another family." That night, as I sat in my study reviewing the evidence that would put Michael Thompson away for the rest of his life, I realized something that filled me with a sense of completion I hadn't felt since retiring. This case wasn't just about protecting my daughter. It was about proving that justice is possible even when evil seems to have all the advantages. It was about showing that a mother's love, combined with professional skill and unwavering determination, could overcome any criminal conspiracy. Michael Thompson had made the mistake of his life when he chose to threaten my family. But more than that, he had awakened something that had been dormant for 5 years, the absolute certainty that some fights are worth everything you have to give. Wednesday morning brought a moment I had been anticipating for weeks, my first face-to-face meeting with Vincent Romano. Agent Collins had arranged for me to observe his interrogation, and as I sat behind the one-way mirror watching this man who had ordered my daughter's death, I felt the cold satisfaction of a hunter who had finally cornered her prey. Romano was smaller than I had expected, but his eyes held the flat, reptilian intelligence of a career criminal who had never shown mercy and never expected to receive any. When Agent Collins mentioned my name during the questioning, his reaction was immediate and visceral. "Elizabeth Astor, the federal agent? I thought she was retired." The fear in his voice was unmistakable. He had researched my reputation and knew exactly what kind of enemy he had made. "She came out of retirement specifically to destroy your organization, Vincent. And as you can see, she was remarkably successful." Agent Collins slid a photograph across the table, a surveillance photo of Romano meeting with Michael outside a warehouse. "This photo was taken by someone who spent 6 months documenting every aspect of your operation. Every meeting, every phone call, every financial transaction." I watched Romano's face as the full scope of our investigation became clear to him. This wasn't a case built on lucky breaks or coincidental discoveries. This was the result of methodical, professional investigation by someone who understood exactly how criminal organizations operate. "You see, Vincent, when you threaten the family of a federal agent, you're not just committing a crime. You're declaring war on someone who has spent decades learning how to win wars exactly like this one." The interrogation continued for 3 hours, and I observed every moment with the clinical interest of someone studying a particularly dangerous specimen. Romano had built his empire by exploiting the most vulnerable relationships in society, the trust between husbands and wives, the love between parents and children. He had turned the sacred bonds of family into weapons for murder and profit. But what struck me most was his complete lack of remorse. When Agent Collins showed him photographs of his victims, Romano looked at them with the same detachment someone might show when reviewing business reports. Maria Santos, Jennifer Walsh, Linda Morrison. To him, they were nothing more than inconvenient obstacles that had to be removed for the sake of efficiency. Thursday brought a development that proved how far-reaching our investigation had become. Detective Rodriguez called with news that investigations in 6 other cities had uncovered similar networks, all apparently inspired by Romano's model. "Elizabeth, we're looking at a nationwide conspiracy that may have resulted in over 40 deaths. Your daughter's case has become the key that unlocked the biggest domestic violence murder conspiracy in American history. 40 deaths. 40 women who had trusted the wrong men, who had discovered inconvenient truths, who had died because they stood in the way of criminal profit." As I listened to Rodriguez describe the scope of what we had uncovered, I felt something that transcended personal satisfaction. I felt the profound responsibility of someone who had been given the chance to speak for the voiceless. Friday afternoon, I received a call that brought everything full circle. It was District Attorney Patricia Hammond, and her voice carried the weight of someone about to make legal history. Elizabeth, we're preparing to file federal charges against 23 defendants in connection with Romano's organization. But we want Michael to be the first one to face trial, and we want you to testify as the primary witness. Testifying against my former son-in-law would mean reliving every moment of Sarah's ordeal, every detail of the conspiracy that had nearly cost her life. But it would also mean ensuring that Michael Thompson faced justice not just for what he had done to my daughter, but for his role in the deaths of 7 other women whose families deserved answers. Patricia, I'll testify, but I have one condition. My voice carried the authority of someone who had spent 35 years in federal service and knew exactly what she was demanding. I want the families of all Romano's victims to be present in the courtroom when Michael is sentenced. These women died alone and afraid, but their families will see their killer face justice surrounded by people who cared enough to fight for them. Saturday evening, as Sarah and I sat in my kitchen reviewing the testimony I would give in federal court, she asked me a question that went to the heart of everything we had experienced. Mom, do you think Michael ever actually loved me, or was I always just a mark to him? The question hung in the air like smoke from a fire that had finally burned out. I looked at my daughter, this brave, intelligent woman who had survived an attempted murder and helped bring down a criminal empire, and gave her the truth she deserved. Sweetheart, men like Michael don't love anyone. They identify targets, study weaknesses, and execute plans. You were never his wife. You were his assignment. But here's what he never understood. When he chose you as his target, he also chose to make an enemy of someone who would never stop hunting him. Sunday morning, I received a call that filled me with a satisfaction deeper than any professional achievement I had ever experienced. It was Agent Martinez with news that Michael had attempted to make a deal with federal prosecutors. Elizabeth, Thompson wants to provide information about other criminal networks in exchange for a reduced sentence. He's claiming that Romano's organization was just one part of a much larger conspiracy. I smiled as I listened to the details of Michael's desperate attempt to save himself by betraying his criminal associates. This was exactly what I had expected. When faced with life in prison, even the most arrogant criminals become remarkably cooperative. What did the prosecutors tell him? I asked, already knowing the answer. They told him that his information might be useful for other cases, but it won't reduce his sentence by a single day. The evidence against him is too strong, and the crimes he's committed are too serious. Michael Thompson is going to prison for the rest of his life, and there's nothing he can offer that will change that. As I hung up the phone, I felt the deep satisfaction of someone who had not only protected her family, but had struck a blow for justice that would resonate for years to come. Michael Thompson, Vincent Romano, and their entire criminal network had learned something that every criminal eventually discovers. There is always someone stronger, smarter, and more determined than you are. And sometimes, that someone is a mother whose daughter you threatened. The final chapter of this story was about to be written in a federal courtroom, and I was going to make sure it ended with the word that mattered most: justice. The federal courthouse in downtown had never felt more like home than it did on the morning of Michael Thompson's trial. As I walked through those familiar halls where I had testified in dozens of cases over 3 decades, I felt the weight of every victim we were representing. This wasn't just about Sarah anymore. This was about Maria Santos, Jennifer Walsh, Linda Morrison, Rebecca Chen, and 7 other women whose voices had been silenced, but whose stories would finally be heard. Sarah walked beside me, her head held high with a dignity that filled me with maternal pride. She had chosen to attend every day of the trial, not as a victim seeking sympathy, but as a survivor demanding justice. "Mom," she said as we approached the courtroom, "I want you to know that no matter what happens in there, you've already given me something Michael never could have taken away, the knowledge that I'm stronger than I ever imagined." The courtroom was packed with family members of Romano's victims, federal agents who had worked the case, and journalists covering what the media had dubbed the Widowmaker conspiracy. But the person I was most aware of was Michael himself, sitting at the defendant's table in an orange jumpsuit that had replaced his expensive suits. When our eyes met, I saw something that satisfied me more than any commendation I had ever received, the look of a predator who had finally become prey. District Attorney Hammond's opening statement was masterful, weaving together the financial evidence, the recorded confessions, and the human cost of Romano's organization into a narrative that left no doubt about Michael's guilt. Ladies and gentlemen of the jury, the man sitting before you is not just a domestic abuser who lost his temper. He is a calculating killer who participated in the systematic murder of 12 innocent women for financial gain. When she called me to the witness stand, I felt the familiar calm that had always preceded my most important testimonies. This was what I had trained for my entire career, the moment when professional expertise meets personal conviction and creates something powerful enough to move mountains. Agent Astor, Hammond began, please tell the jury about your background and how you became involved in this case. I looked directly at the jury as I spoke, making eye contact with each member to ensure they understood the gravity of what they were about to hear. I am Elizabeth Astor, retired special agent with the Federal Bureau of Investigation. I spent 35 years investigating organized crime and domestic violence cases. I became involved in this case when the defendant, who was married to my daughter, beat her severely and then attempted to have her murdered as part of a criminal conspiracy. The prosecutor led me through the evidence methodically. The financial records showing money laundering, the surveillance photos documenting meetings with known criminals, the recorded confessions revealing the scope of the conspiracy. But the moment that defined the entire trial came when Hammond asked me to explain the pattern of murders that Romano's organization had been committing. The defendants operated what can only be described as a murder-for-profit enterprise, I testified, my voice carrying the authority of 3 decades in federal service. They would identify women with significant assets, successful businesswomen, inheritors of family wealth, professionals with substantial savings. Then they would deploy operatives like Michael Thompson to court these women, marry them, gain access to their finances, and ultimately eliminate them when they became suspicious or inconvenient. I watched the jury's faces as I described the systematic nature of the murders. These weren't crimes of passion or domestic disputes that had escalated. These were calculated executions carried out by a criminal organization that had turned the murder of innocent women into a business model. The defendant, Michael Thompson, was not a husband who lost control. He was an assassin who specialized in killing the women who trusted him most. During cross-examination, Michael's attorney tried to portray him as a minor figure in Romano's organization, someone who had been manipulated and coerced into participating in crimes he didn't fully understand. It was a strategy I had seen countless times over the years, and I was ready for it. Agent Astor, the defense attorney said, isn't it possible that my client was as much a victim of Vincent Romano as your daughter was? The question was designed to create doubt about Michael's culpability, to suggest that he had been forced into his criminal activities by threats or manipulation. I looked at Michael as I answered, making sure he could see the contempt in my eyes. Counselor, I have listened to hours of recorded conversations between your client and Vincent Romano. In those conversations, Michael Thompson discusses the murder of my daughter with the same casual tone someone might use to discuss weekend plans. He was not coerced or manipulated. He was an enthusiastic participant who took pride in his ability to deceive and destroy innocent women. The defense attorney pressed further. But Agent Astor, you've admitted that your investigation was motivated by personal feelings rather than professional objectivity. How can we trust testimony from someone who was seeking revenge against the man who hurt her daughter? It was exactly the question I had been expecting, and I had prepared for it with the thoroughness of someone who had testified in federal court dozens of times. Counselor, in 35 years of federal service, I investigated hundreds of criminals who had harmed people I cared about, crime victims, fellow agents, innocent civilians. Personal motivation doesn't compromise professional investigation. It enhances it. When you care deeply about the outcome, you work harder, you dig deeper, and you make sure that every piece of evidence is bulletproof. The case against your client isn't the product of emotional vengeance. It's the result of methodical professional investigation by someone who refused to let another family suffer the way mine did. As I left the witness stand, I caught Sarah's eye in the gallery. She was crying, but they were tears of pride, not pain. Her mother had just spoken for every woman who had ever been betrayed by someone they loved, every family that had ever lost a daughter to domestic violence, every victim who had been silenced by fear and intimidation. That evening, as we waited for the jury to begin deliberations, Sarah and I sat in my kitchen, the same kitchen where she had arrived with a bruised face just 2 months ago. "Mom," she said, "watching you testify today, I finally understood something. You didn't just save my life, you taught me that we never have to be victims. We can always choose to be fighters." The next morning would bring a verdict that would determine whether Michael Thompson spent the rest of his life in prison or whether the system would somehow fail the women he had helped to murder. But regardless of what 12 strangers decided in that jury room, I knew that we had already won the most important victory. We had proven that no criminal conspiracy is stronger than a mother's love, and no predator is more dangerous than a woman who refuses to let evil triumph. The jury deliberated for 6 hours. 6 hours that felt like 6 years, as Sarah and I sat in the courthouse cafeteria, surrounded by the families of Romano's other victims. Maria Santos's mother clutched a rosary and whispered prayers in Spanish. Jennifer Walsh's sister paced by the windows, unable to sit still. Linda Morrison's father sat in stoic silence, his hands folded so tightly his knuckles were white. We were united by grief, but more than that, we were united by hope that justice would finally be served. At 3:15 in the afternoon, the bailiff announced that the jury had reached a verdict. As we filed back into the courtroom, I felt the familiar tension that always preceded the most crucial moments in any case. This was when months of investigation, weeks of testimony, and years of suffering would be distilled into a single word: guilty or not guilty. Michael sat at the defendant's table with the rigid posture of a man trying to project confidence he didn't feel. His attorney whispered something in his ear, but Michael's eyes were fixed on the jury box, searching their faces for any hint of what they had decided. When the jury foreman stood to read the verdict, the silence in the courtroom was absolute. On the charge of conspiracy to commit murder in the first degree, we find the defendant, Michael Thompson, guilty. The words hit the courtroom like a thunderclap. Maria Santos's mother began to sob with relief. Jennifer Walsh's sister reached over and squeezed my hand, but I kept my eyes on Michael, watching his face as the reality of his situation became undeniable. On the charge of money laundering in the first degree, we find the defendant, Michael Thompson, guilty. On the charge of racketeering, we find the defendant, Michael Thompson, guilty. On the charge of domestic violence in the first degree, we find the defendant, Michael Thompson, guilty. With each guilty verdict, I watched Michael's composure crumble a little more. This was the moment when his arrogance finally collapsed under the weight of truth. Judge Patricia Williams called for order as the families of the victims began to react to the verdict. When the courtroom was quiet again, she addressed Michael directly. "Mr. Thompson, you have been found guilty on all counts. Before I impose sentence, do you have anything to say to this court?" It was the traditional opportunity for defendants to show remorse, to apologize, to demonstrate some recognition of the harm they had caused. Michael stood slowly, and for a moment I thought he might finally show some humanity, some acknowledgement of the pain he had inflicted on so many families. Instead, he turned toward the gallery where the victims' families sat and said something that crystallized everything evil about his character. "I regret that my business partnership with Vincent Romano was discovered before we could complete our expansion plans." The audacity was breathtaking. Even faced with life in prison, Michael Thompson couldn't bring himself to acknowledge that his business partnership involved the murder of innocent women. He was treating the deaths of 12 human beings as nothing more than failed business ventures. The families in the gallery gasped at his callousness, but I felt something different: vindication. This statement proved everything I had testified about Michael's character. He wasn't a man who had been led astray or manipulated into criminal activity. He was a cold-blooded killer who viewed murder as just another business transaction. No jury, no judge, no reasonable person could hear those words and have any doubt about who Michael Thompson really was. Judge Williams' response was swift and merciless. "Mr. Thompson, in 30 years on the federal bench, I have never encountered a defendant who showed such complete disregard for human life. Your statement today confirms what the evidence in this case has already demonstrated. You are a dangerous predator who poses an ongoing threat to society. She paused, looking at the families in the gallery before continuing. The crimes you committed weren't just attacks on individual victims. They were attacks on the fundamental trust that holds families and communities together. You exploited the love that wives have for their husbands, the trust that families place in their members, and the hope that marriage represents sanctuary and safety. Therefore, on the charge of conspiracy to commit murder in the first degree, I sentence you to life in prison without the possibility of parole. On the charge of money laundering in the first degree, I sentence you to 20 years in prison. On the charge of racketeering, I sentence you to 15 years in prison. On the charge of domestic violence in the first degree, I sentence you to 10 years in prison. These sentences will be served consecutively, ensuring that you will spend the remainder of your natural life in federal prison. As the bailiff led Michael away in handcuffs, he turned one last time toward the gallery. His eyes found mine, and in that moment, I saw something that filled me with profound satisfaction, the look of a predator who had finally met someone more dangerous than himself. He had spent 5 years living in my family, planning my daughter's death, believing that he was the smartest person in the room. Now he knew the truth. After the courtroom cleared, Sarah and I stood outside the federal building where I had begun my career 35 years ago. "Mom," she said, "I keep thinking about what Michael said in there. Even now, even facing life in prison, he still doesn't understand that those women were human beings, not business obstacles." She was right, and that was perhaps the most chilling aspect of the entire case. Michael Thompson and Vincent Romano had created a criminal enterprise built on the fundamental premise that women's lives had no value beyond their financial assets. They had turned love into a weapon and marriage into a murder plot. But they had made one crucial miscalculation. They had underestimated the power of a mother's love and a federal agent's determination. They had believed that their victims were isolated and vulnerable, that no one would fight for them with the skills and resources necessary to bring them to justice. That evening, as Sarah and I sat in my kitchen, the same kitchen where this nightmare had begun 2 months ago, we received a call that put our victory in perspective. It was Agent Collins with news that investigations inspired by our case had resulted in arrests in 8 different cities. Romano's model had been more widespread than anyone had imagined, but our success had given law enforcement agencies across the country the tools they needed to dismantle similar networks. "Elizabeth," Agent Collins said, "what you and Sarah accomplished didn't just save one life. It saved dozens of lives. There are women alive today because you refused to let Michael Thompson succeed." As I hung up the phone, I realized that this case had been about more than justice for the women who had already died. It had been about preventing future murders, protecting future families, ensuring that other mothers would never have to experience what we had experienced. The final chapter was yet to be written, but the ending was no longer in doubt. Evil had been confronted by something stronger, and justice had prevailed. 6 months after Michael Thompson was sentenced to life in prison, Sarah and I established the Elizabeth Astor Foundation for Family Safety. It wasn't something I had planned during my federal career, but surviving this ordeal had taught us both that justice doesn't end with convictions. It continues with prevention. We created a resource center where women could access the kind of professional investigation services that had saved Sarah's life, services that most families could never afford on their own. Our first case came from a woman in Seattle whose husband's financial behavior reminded her of the news coverage about Michael Thompson. Within 3 weeks, our team of retired federal agents and private investigators had uncovered evidence of money laundering that led to the arrest of another Romano-style operation. The woman's husband had been planning her death for 6 months, but unlike the 12 women who had died before our case broke open, she survived because she had somewhere to turn for help. The foundation grew beyond anything I had imagined. Detective Rodriguez joined us full-time, bringing his expertise in financial crimes. Agent Collins provided oversight for our most complex cases. Detective Walsh developed training programs that taught women how to recognize the warning signs of financial manipulation that often preceded domestic violence murders. We became the resource I wished had existed for Maria Santos, Jennifer Walsh, and all the other women who had died alone and afraid. But the most meaningful development came from an unexpected source. 3 months after Michael's sentencing, I received a letter from Amanda Clark, the woman who had been his accomplice in the affair that precipitated his attack on Sarah. The letter was postmarked from federal prison, where she was serving a 10-year sentence for her role in Romano's organization. "Mrs. Astor," she wrote, "I know that nothing I say can undo the harm I helped to cause your family. But I want you to know that watching your testimony during Michael's trial was the first time I understood what we were really doing. I had convinced myself that we were just helping men escape unhappy marriages, but you made me see that we were participating in murder. I am providing information to federal investigators about similar operations in 12 other states. It's not enough to make up for what I did, but it's all I have to give." Amanda's information led to the largest domestic violence conspiracy investigation in American history. Over the next year, federal agents arrested 83 people in connection with networks that had murdered at least 67 women across 15 states. The scope was staggering. Romano's operation had been just one cell in a nationwide conspiracy that had turned domestic violence into a billion-dollar criminal enterprise. Sarah threw herself into the Foundation's work with the passion of someone who had discovered her life's purpose. She completed her law degree and specialized in cases involving financial abuse and domestic violence. Watching her transform from victim to advocate filled me with a pride that transcended anything I had achieved in my federal career. My daughter hadn't just survived her ordeal, she had become a force for protecting other families from similar horrors. 1 year after Michael's conviction, we received an invitation that completed our journey in the most meaningful way possible. The Federal Bureau of Investigation asked us to speak at their annual conference on domestic violence and organized crime. Standing at that podium, looking out at hundreds of agents who would carry our lessons into their own cases, I felt the deep satisfaction of someone who had not only served justice, but had helped to redefine it. "Ladies and gentlemen," I began, "a year ago, my daughter arrived at my door at 1 a.m. with a bruised face and a broken heart. What we discovered in the following weeks wasn't just that her husband was planning to kill her. It was that domestic violence had become the foundation for criminal enterprises that were systematically murdering women across the country." I paused, looking at Sarah in the front row, remembering the terrified woman who had collapsed in my doorway and marveling at the confident advocate she had become. But here's what I learned from this case. Evil succeeds when good people believe they are powerless to stop it. The criminals who murdered 67 women believed that their victims were isolated and defenseless. They were wrong. They had simply never encountered a victim whose family refused to accept defeat. The speech continued for 45 minutes, but the message was simple. Justice is not something that happens to us. It's something we create through determination, skill, and the refusal to let evil triumph over good. Michael Thompson, Vincent Romano, and their entire network had been defeated not by luck or coincidence, but by the systematic application of professional expertise motivated by love and fury in equal measure. As Sarah and I flew home from Washington, she asked me a question that put everything in perspective. "Mom, do you think Michael understands now what he was really doing? Do you think he realizes that those women were human beings, not just obstacles to his success?" I considered the question carefully before answering. "Sweetheart, men like Michael never truly understand the humanity of their victims because understanding would make their crimes impossible to commit. But understanding isn't necessary for justice to be served. Michael Thompson will spend the rest of his life in prison, not because he learned empathy, but because we refused to let his lack of empathy destroy another family." 2 years later, as I write this final chapter, the Elizabeth Astor Foundation has helped protect over 300 families from domestic violence conspiracies. Sarah has become one of the country's leading experts on financial abuse and domestic violence. Vincent Romano died in federal prison, still maintaining that his organization was simply a business venture that had been misunderstood by law enforcement. Michael Thompson remains in federal prison, where he will die. He has never expressed remorse for his crimes, never acknowledged the humanity of his victims, never shown any recognition of the pain he inflicted on so many families. But his lack of remorse is irrelevant. What matters is that he will never hurt another family, and the network he helped to build has been completely destroyed. If you're listening to this story and wondering what lessons it contains for your own life, let me leave you with this. Evil often presents itself in familiar forms, wearing the masks of people we trust and love. The greatest protection against such evil is not suspicion or paranoia, but the knowledge that you are never as powerless as predators want you to believe. My name is Elizabeth Astor. I'm 64 years old now, and I've spent the last 3 years of my life proving that a mother's love, combined with professional skill and absolute determination, can overcome any criminal conspiracy. Michael Thompson thought he was marrying into a family of victims. Instead, he had chosen to make war on a family of fighters. And in that war, as in all wars between good and evil, there could be only one possible outcome: justice served, evil defeated, and families protected for generations to come. The fight continues, but the outcome is no longer in doubt. Love wins, justice prevails, and mothers like me will always be watching, always be ready, and always be more dangerous than the monsters who threaten our children.